The Wagner Group is notorious, not just for its actions in Ukraine, but also its growing influence and operations in other countries, particularly in Africa. But the recent Wagner-led mutiny attempt, which saw the mercenary group's boss Evgeny Prigozhin challenge Vladimir Putin but then back down, could have risked putting these foreign missions into jeopardy. So in this video, we'll explain the extent of Wagner operations in Africa and what these recent developments might mean for them going forward. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start by just explaining how Wagner got into Africa. The origins of the mercenary group trace back to 2014, when it was formed by a neo-Nazi Russian army officer called Dmitry Utkin. Wagner aided the fight of the two separatist pro-Russian republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, with indirect support from the Kremlin, which gave Putin a degree of plausible deniability and protected him from international criticism. The opportunity to use the group in other parts of the world soon became apparent. Since the Cold War, Russia has maintained good relationships with a handful of African countries, usually because these countries previously had Soviet-aligned leaderships and used to buy Soviet weapons. More recently, when pro-Kremlin, or at least anti-Western regimes, in these countries were threatened, Russia would send in Wagner to defend them. At the time, Wagner was mostly composed of former Russian and Central Asian soldiers, not convicts from penal colonies like in Ukraine, and before the invasion, there were an estimated 5,000 Wagner troops stationed in Africa. Now, we may never know the full extent of Wagner's operations in Africa, but the most prominent examples of their direct military engagement are the Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan, and Libya. And Wagner's influence has been particularly notable in the Central African Republic. The CAR's president used Wagner mercenaries to fight off rebel forces all the way back in 2018, after which they became an integral part of the president's inner circle. As a result, Russia is considered the Central African Republic's closest ally, with Russian flags decorating the streets and the Russian language even being taught at schools there. In exchange for support and protection, Wagner received concessions from the country's natural wealth. This is why Prigozhin set up a CAR-based mining company, Midas Resources, which has an allowance to mine gold in the country. The site it runs has an estimated value of $1 billion. Another Wagner-linked company, Diamville, participated in a scheme to ship gold and diamonds from the CAR to the United Arab Emirates and Europe. Wagner also profits from the timber industry, receiving unrestricted logging rights across 187,000 hectares of forest. Moving to West Africa now, in Mali, Russia has used Wagner to undermine the West, especially France, whose troops have now pulled out of the country after relations broke down with Mali's military government. The UN peacekeeping force, MINUSMA, has been stationed in Mali since 2013 to fight ISIS and Al-Qaeda insurgents. Over the last decade, up to 300 peacekeepers have died, and the mission failed to contain the insurgency. To make matters worse, Malians don't get on well with the peacekeepers, and often view them as a covert extension of French power. For these reasons, Mali is now requesting the withdrawal of UN forces from the country, and is seeking the help of Wagner mercenaries instead. Wagner's brutality and offensive strategy is more in line with what the ruling military junta expects. This seems to be in line with the will of the locals too. According to a German survey, more than 90% of Malayans have confidence in Wagner. This is despite UN reports that Wagner soldiers reportedly engaged in atrocities against the civilian population in the town of Morua, which was supposed to include executions, torture, and rape. Looking towards Sudan now, the ongoing civil conflict has also been an opportunity for the group to assert Russian influence. According to Sudanese authorities, Wagner is supplying the RSF paramilitary fighters, led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, with surface-to-air missiles in his fight against the country's army. Once again, Moscow wants to leverage its support in an effort to have access to resources. But perhaps the largest Wagner operation in Africa can be found in Libya, where they deployed an estimated 2,000 fighters, experts and administrators to back up General Khalifa Haftar, a pro-Russian secular military leader and supreme commander of the Libyan National Army. The Libyan civil war saw Haftar's Tobruk-based government fight against the Western-backed Tripoli-based government. After the end of the civil war, which resulted in a compromise and a formation of a unified government, Haftar redeployed Wagner to protect the vital oil fields in the east and south of the country, giving him significant leverage in negotiations and securing funding for his military. So that's how far Wagner's influence spread across Africa. Which brings us to the main question of this video. What will the recent mutiny mean for Wagner operations in Africa? After all, African states use Wagner's services with the promise of having a good relationship with Russia, which they still consider a significant world power. A rift between Wagner and the Kremlin would mean that those states would have to choose whose side they're on. If a scenario were to occur, Wagner could lose its lucrative contracts, Russia could lose its military foothold in Africa, while African leaders would become more vulnerable and unable to quell unrest. Since a power vacuum is not in the interests of any party involved, Russia has, despite their own inability to rely on Wagner, promised things will stay the way they are. Just days after Wagner's mutiny, a Russian envoy met with Haftar to assure him that the approximately 2,000 Wagner operatives would stay in place. During the mutiny in June, Wagner troops in Africa stayed put, with the mercenaries in Mali and the CAR continuing to fight against insurgents as before. Despite this, plenty of uncertainty remains. Since no one knows whether hostilities between Putin and Prigozhin are definitely over, and whether Wagner mercenaries will or won't be folded into the Russian army in full, their partners in Africa have doubts that the current arrangement will last as they are. The internal rift also hurts Russia's projection of power. The whole affair made Putin appear weak, and some of these countries may feel the need to look to some other partners on the world stage in order to diversify their pool of international partners. Analysts also expect that these countries will at least approach Wagner with greater caution. However, as long as African warlords and dictators need armed men to prop them up, Russia will probably try to provide them in exchange for resources, because it remains a lucrative business and helps them assert their influence worldwide. Whether they'll remain under the Wagner banner for long remains to be seen.
If you want more updates on this story and others, then be sure to check out our show, The Daily Briefing. Now, we obviously discuss a whole load of news across the TLDR network, but The Daily Briefing is your quick update, getting you up to speed on the world's biggest political issues in just a matter of minutes. Now, a bunch of other news organizations obviously do these kinds of daily summaries, but coming from TLDR, you know that it has our normal, unbiased, explanatory, and only semi-serious tone. So if you want to feel fully tuned in, check out The Daily Briefing. You can watch on YouTube or Nebula just by searching for the TLDR Daily Briefing, or you can listen by searching for us in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for your support.